Yep, we're hearing you.
And we see your program. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I took a look at the YouTube channel just to get a sense of how to prepare for this. And you all have had a real just star-studded slate of speakers. So it's a real honor to be part of that lineup. Also, thank you for all the amazing work you do, watching the introduction and all of the amazing activities you have. We desperately need a lot of more restoration of our native plants. So thank you all for that work. So the work that I'm going to talk about today is mostly in collaboration with Mary Cadanasso at UC Davis and with the Hopland Research and Extension Center up in Mendocino County. Just to give a very brief background on myself, I am a professor in the Department of Plant Sciences at UC Davis, and my specialty is ecosystem management and restoration. And so I am very excited when folks are out there trying to restore not just our native species, but also a lot of our ecosystem services. So just to give a brief overview of what we'll talk about today, talk about California's grasslands, why they're important and interesting, the changes that are occurring in them, and how we can manage for resilience. And the fun thing about talking to Native Plant Society folks is you all love and adore all of our diverse plant types and ecosystem types. So you all very much know that there are lots of different types of grasslands here in California. Some of them are dominated by natives through management, some of them through interesting environmental conditions such as vernal pools or serpentine areas. And of course, a lot of them wind up being very much dominated by exotic annual grasses. About 90% of the cover of our grasslands in California are non-natives. Even so, though, it is still one of the biodiversity hotspots, even in this very invaded state. In a typical 30-meter by 30-meter area, we have about 50 different plant species. That's a pretty phenomenal amount of diversity. We also know that these grasslands are the core habitat for 90% of our state-listed rare and endangered species. They're also really important economically in California. When we look at our top agricultural commodities, two of the top three, dairy products and cattle and calves, are very much supported by our grasslands. About 75% of livestock forage in California is provided by the grasses in our grasslands and oak woodlands. And so these are very important economically. They're also really important in terms of ecosystem services, the things that they provide to us that we all depend on. So there have been a lot of really interesting studies showing that the wildflowers that are in our grasslands are really critical for providing pollinators to our extensive agricultural systems here in California. We also know that these systems store a lot of carbon. We might think, well, we're a seasonally dry system. Maybe we're not that important in terms of carbon storage, but we're actually store as much carbon as some of those very iconic Midwestern grasslands with a very deep soil organic matter. So we have an important role to play in carbon sequestration here in California. They're also very important in terms of the water cycle. When we think about a typical watershed here in California, a huge amount of our water comes through our grasslands. And so they're really important in terms of storing that water, in terms of filtering it and making it clean. Of course, we're seeing a lot of changes. And in fact, of all of our ecosystems in California, grasslands are our most altered ecosystem. A lot of land is being converted both to agriculture and also to urban areas. We see that also that really changes the management of them. A lot of our grasslands have evolved to fire and to herbivores as a part of that system. And as a lot of our grasslands are moving out of ranches and into smaller ranchettes, essentially they're not being managed the same way anymore. And so they're getting a little bit choked out by a lot of these non-native species. We also see that there have been big changes in our fire regimes, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And one of the more significant changes we've had, again, is the massive amount of non-native species that have come into these systems. For 250 to 300 years now, our grasslands have been dominated by non-native species, and we're having continuing different types of non-native species come in and invade these systems. And that is being exacerbated by nitrogen deposition, essentially air pollution that's coming from factories, that's coming from our car emissions, that's coming from agricultural areas, is essentially fertilizing a lot of our grasslands and a lot of our natural systems in California, making it more difficult to manage and enhancing those exotic species. So in the midst of all these changes, we really need to think about new management approaches. Just to give a sense of some of these global changes, like the nitrogen deposition, here we've got a little map of that. Just get my pointer going. Here we go. So in this map here of California, the more sort of red and yellow you are, the higher of a hotspot of this nitrogen pollution that's occurring. And so we do have some extensive areas in California of this nitrogen pollution. And on the left here is a graph of an experiment that my lab's done, looking at when we have an unfertilized system, so low amounts of nitrogen deposition, versus one where we mimic these higher amounts of nitrogen deposition. You can see that we greatly increase the cover of a lot of our noxious weeds, particularly things like goat grass and medusa head, which are some of our more recent pretty nasty invaders. Don't have to tell everybody here, we're also seeing some pretty big changes in climate. This top graph is looking at precipitation and how it's the middle line here is average, and then right, if we're in blue, we have higher than average precipitation. If we're in orange, we're having lower than average. And you can see, yeah, we've had some wetter years and drier years over the past few decades, but particularly if you look at the graph below it in terms of temperature, what we do see is a very marked trend to hotter conditions. What this means is that in our drier years, we're actually having a lot more moisture stress of our plants. And so we're getting a lot, even if the precipitation isn't that much less than maybe a drought that happened 50 years ago, the functional way that drought hits the plants is a lot harder because it's a lot hotter. We've also seen a big change over the years in the amount of area burned in California. And I think we've all sort of seen it and been exposed to the smoke, if not, right, having to evacuate houses and things like that. It's really become very, very prevalent in the last few years, and having a lot of sites not just burn, but burn multiple times in a few years. So we've got lots and lots of changes. We do see that these grasslands change a lot. So even though these are dominated by non-native species, they're still sort of a botanical wonder. And for speaking to a bunch of plant nerds, right, I know you all can appreciate California grasslands are super unique. So in most grasslands across the world, they're dominated by perennial species. In fact, the species that are dominant here in California that are annual species that come from Mediterranean Europe, they're actually early successional species in Europe. They do not dominate those grasslands. They're just there shortly after a fire, shortly after some grazing, and then they get replaced by perennials. We have no idea why California grasslands don't have that successional shift to perennial systems. Every other grassland in the world that's wet enough, that's what happens. It's only more these desert grasslands where you just have a little bit of rain here and there that tend to be annual dominated. That said, we are seeing more and more of our grasslands across the world turn into annual dominated. So our understanding in California is really essential for people across the world to understand what's happening. There's a lot of unique challenges and opportunities in terms of this annual system. So here we just have a picture of from the same hill slope looking right in one year where we've got more lupin dominating, and another year where we've got grass dominating. And this is very common in California and in an annual system, that you have different species blinking in and out at different times. So that does give us at least some ability to make sure we've got some diversity, make sure we've got native species in there. On the flip side, right, it's really nice if we've got perennial species, we can get those species in, and once they're established, they take up space. We don't have that in this annual system, right? There's a lot of blinking on and off, which makes management pretty difficult. So when we are thinking about how to manage these systems, particularly under all of these changing conditions, we have to get to the basics of what keeps these systems resilient, what lets them recover from different types of disturbances and maintain themselves over time. And so I'm going to talk about a few different things. The first is thinking about diversity. And I'm just going to very briefly touch on this because this is something probably you're all very familiar with. But the more different types of species, the more genotypes we have of species, the more diversity of different types of grasslands we have, the better insurance we have to all of this variation that's happening, right? The more probability we're going to have some aspect of those systems be able to handle the droughts and the fires and whatever other changes are coming down the pipe. The simplest graph of this is actually not from California, but the same principles are true in California. This is an example in a Minnesota grassland where they had they planted plots that either had one species and all the way up to 16 species. And they looked at how the number of species they had in the system influence here on this top graph is ecosystem stability. So it is when we're thinking about plant cover, when we're thinking about plant biomass, to what extent did that stay constant, no matter if we had a cold year or a hot year or a wet year or dry year. And you can see there's lots of variation, but increased diversity does very much increase stability. And on the bottom graph, we're looking stability of a given species, and we see that that decreases as we get more species. And that is the beauty of diversity, is that when we've got certain conditions that aren't good for a certain species, it can blink out and somebody else can come in, right? And that is a really, really important principle for diversity. And that's something we very much see in California. And it was nice to see all the wildflower, seasons celebration at the start of this, because wildflowers really are core to the resilience of our grasslands. They are our emergency first responders, whether we have drought, whether we have fire, whether we have gopher disturbance. They are the key responders under really tough conditions in California. We don't see them a lot of the time, right? They're dormant in the seed bank. They can be dormant for decades. And they blink on and off. When certain conditions are good, they come out and they can really dominate. There's still a lot we're trying to learn about how we can understand which of these forbs get turned on in a given year. There are plenty of times in restoration we spend lots of money on these amazing wildflower seeds. We put them out there and they just don't come up. And then 5 years later, I come out and I'm like, oh, there you are, right? But that is how they've evolved. They very much sort of hang out and wait for an opportunity. So it is an important thing when you are doing restoration and working with wildflowers. Don't worry if you don't see them all the time, right? But the key is they're there when we most need them. The problem is at least historically, they've been there when we've most needed them. We are seeing that both the amount of wildflower seeds sitting in the soil and the diversity of them has been declining over the years. And there's lots of different reasons for this, and we're not sure what the relative importance of some of this is, but some of the things that different studies have pointed to is having warmer and drier winters is decreasing that seed bank. Certainly the dominance of invasive grasses that don't give the wildflowers a chance to establish is really important. That thatch buildup very much, that particularly happens with those exotic grasses, is really detrimental to the wildflowers. But with that too, what we see very much is a lack of disturbance. So for a long time, we were not intentionally burning our grasslands. We were suppressing fire. And I think in the past few years, we've all become a lot more aware of how important fire is as a tool for managing diversity. Same thing with grazing, right? Some kind of disturbance is really critical in grasslands. Otherwise, they just get choked out, right, by these big, nasty thatch patches. This is also then exacerbated by nitrogen deposition, right? That nitrogen pollution, which enhances those grasses, enhances that thatch, and drowns out our forbs. So when we're thinking, right, in a little cartoon picture of like when we might have our grass year, when we might have our forb year, those annual grasses very much rely on seed production from the previous season. They do not have a long-lived seed bank. Most of them have almost no carryover from year to year. So essentially, right, at the end of the spring, they'll drop a lot of seed. 99% of that seed germinates with the rains in the fall, and very little carries over. So if something happens, right, to that seed bank, or if there's a big germination period of those grasses, and then we have a fall drought and they all die off, they're not there to replace themselves. And this is when those forbs really shine, right? They hang out in that seed bank dormant until essentially there's room. So this gives us a lot. We know how important they are, and there's been a lot of work right now trying to think about how do we make sure that that forb seed bank is there. And there's really great work that Lauren Hallett's group has done in the Sierra foothills, where they were looking at ungrazed areas and then areas that were more moderately grazed. So typical of what we might do in a conservation grazing setup. And they exposed those different grazed areas to different conditions, right? To wet conditions, to just normal rainfall, and to drier conditions. And they did this over 2 years. And in the dark gray are moderately grazed total vegetation cover, and the light gray is ungrazed. And what we can see is, especially in 2014, under dry conditions, the cover of vegetation in the ungrazed systems just tanked, right? So the idea is that drought in an area that doesn't have grazing really had much lower plant cover, much lower biomass to support not just grazers, but also wildlife. What happened here? It turned out that that history of moderate grazing just made enough room over the years for a moderate amount of forbs to get in there and get lots of forbs in the seed bank, so that when we had that dry year and those grasses crashed, those forbs were able to get in there and take up the room. So essentially, grazing knocks back some of those grasses and opens up the opportunity for forbs. So there's a lot of interest now. Is that true of every disturbance? Is there anything that sets back grasses? Can that help build our wildflower seed bank? And so we had a somewhat great and very unfortunate at the same time opportunity to look at this at the Hopland Research Extension Center in Mendocino County. They had been right at the edge of the Mendocino Complex fire in summer of 2018. And so when I'm saying they're right on the edge, like they're right, like this is literally part of the field station that didn't burn, right? Here's the edge of the fire. Another example, right below that, literally the dirt road was the end of the fire. So we had a lot of opportunity to look at adjacent areas that had burned and not burned. We also had the cool opportunity where they had done a number of prescribed fires about a month before that wildfire. So we were able to compare prescribed fire to wildfire. And then they also have a lot of sheep grazing on this research station. And so we're able to look at how fire and grazing interact in terms of the impacts of fire and post-fire recovery. And so in this grazing here in the upper right, you can see pretty remarkable fence line where the wildfire came through like all of this area. But what happened on the left that had been grazed in the spring shortly before the fire and didn't have a lot of grass biomass, yeah, there's a little bit of black char on the ground, but you can barely tell that it burned versus on the right where there had been a lot of fuel buildup, not only did the grass, burn and become like total ash. But if you look at the oaks, they did much, much more poorly with all of that, fuel load. So gave us the ability to look at some of these interactions. In particular, right, getting back to our wildflowers, does that help? The assumption is it would be really important because we know that those annual grasses, again, don't have a seed bank in the soil. Their seeds fall at the end of the spring. A lot of them are sitting in that thatch. So studies in the past have shown about 85% of that grass seed production is just sitting there in the thatch. So very, very vulnerable to fire. And so when we looked to see how much grass seed was sitting in those soils after the fire, here on this graph on the top, we have the number of grass seeds. And so this is, we took soil from these plots and put them into a greenhouse. So, and then continuously harvested whoever came up. So the idea is we are kind of flushing out everybody who was sitting in that seed bank. And you can see for grasses in the unburned plots, we had really high number of grasses. Both the prescribed fire and the wildfire, very, very low, right? Decreased the amount of seeds by about 80%. For forbs, we didn't have really a consistent or significant effect. There was some variability across our plots, but we didn't see that fire change germination again in that greenhouse. So that total amount of what was there. Now, how about grazing? Does grazing before fire change this? So not surprisingly, right from that picture I'd shown you where if you graze before fire, the fire didn't really hit very much that soil surface. And so here again on the top, we have the number of grass seeds that could germinate that were in that seed bank. Black is ungrazed, the gray is grazed. So, what we're finding, not much of a difference in our unburned areas, but in our two types of burned areas, much, much, much higher grass seed survival when the areas had been grazed. When we look at our wildflowers, so again, here's like getting the total amount that is sitting in the soil. It's not necessarily did wildfire, trigger this or not. What we see is that across all of both the burned, but also the unburned, that a history of grazing meant we had a lot more seeds in that seed bank. And not just a lot more, we actually had a lot higher diversity. So, right, what this tells us is that that history of grazing gave us a much more robust, right, seed bank to recover from fire. So did this matter in terms of who actually came up, right? This is telling us who's potentially there. But of course, right, because anybody that came up, we identified it, we got rid of it, and that made room for the next set of germinants coming up. What actually happened out in the field? So on the left, we have the germination data that I mentioned. On the right, we have at the end of the first growing season after the fire, what is our cover? So we were initially really disappointed because, oh my gosh, we got such a great hit to these invasive, annual grasses. Like clearly we're not going to see that much. And by the end of the season, like no, they just covered everything, right? And so we were really disappointed by that initially. So even though 80% of the seeds went, they have such a prolific amount of seeds, it didn't matter. But, right, but there's a big but here. They did wind up growing, right, and taking up all the space by the end. But if we looked at late March, so right, a little bit later than we are now in the season, and we looked at the amount of bare ground that was there, we did see a lot more bare ground in the fires compared to unburned areas. What that means is there's the potential for those wildflowers to come in. So on the bottom graph now, so again, the top is what could germinate. On the bottom is what actually came up. We do see double the cover of forbs in our burned plots compared to our unburned plots, right? And almost like almost 80% cover. So we had phenomenal amount of wildflowers coming up in those fires, even though there had been a lot of grasses as well. I saw somebody had a hand up. Somebody might have to help me. I don't know how to navigate hands
I
on
can,
webinars.
yeah, let me go back to that. It's, where'd that go?
Okay.
I think they put their hand down again because I've lost it.
Okay. I know how to do hands on the like normal Zoom thing, but I don't know how to do it on webinars. So,
Yeah, anyway, you're right. It was up, but now it's down.
okay. Well, feel free to put in chat, and then maybe somebody can just interrupt me and read what was in there. So, when we are then thinking about this balance between our annual exotic grasses and our forbs, again, fire is actually a really nice aspect of that, where we were able to eliminate 80% of the grass seeds through the fire. And while that didn't decrease grass cover, what it did was, by the end of the season, it did decrease grass cover a lot in that early spring, allowing a lot of our wildflowers to get in there. The other important part is we had a lot more recovery of our forbs and a lot more diversity of those wildflowers that came up when there had been a history of grazing before the fire. There's another aspect of this. So it turned out that this is just a timeline of rainfall at our site. And so our fire happened right at the tail end of a dry year. The year of recovery was very wet, but then we had two of the driest years on record. Like the only drier year at the site was in 1924. So there now we had that question of, oh, well, does that history of having a fire, building up that forb seed bank, help us recover from drought? And so here again, we went and we looked at who was sitting in that seed bank. And you can see here again, same format of the graph, that on the left we have unburned, and then on the right we have our two different types of burns, and then also with ungrazed in black, grazed in gray. And grazing didn't really change drought response, but the history of fire meant, again, about doubling the number of wildflowers that were able to come up from the seed bank. When we look at what that meant in terms of cover, it was a little messier, so we just have a trend. It's not significant, but we did, see that history of fire did mean about 30% higher cover of wildflowers in response to the drought. So it's really important to be thinking about how to maintain these wildflowers and looking at a sequence of different disturbances that help prepare the system to be able to respond to the next set of disturbance. There is a lot of really important questions when it comes to actually implementing this. And this is something that my research group and a lot of other folks are working on, as well. So, okay, disturbance speaks back the grass. It lets some of those forbs come out, gets their seeds into that seed bank, super important. But is any disturbance fine? Do certain disturbances help species that respond to fire, and other kinds of disturbances help species that respond to drought? Or is it all good? We don't know yet, right? So we're doing a lot of active work on that and looking at different types of management practices that are common in grasslands to think about how we can manage for that increased seed bank. The other thing, of course, is when we're doing this for conservation, how often do we have to do this? Do I have to go rent goats or sheep every year? Or if I do it once every 10 years, is that good enough? Similarly, if I can do like a managed burn, how often do I have to do that? I unfortunately don't have that information for you now, but I assure you lots of us are working on that so that we can have better advice on what we can do to keep those wildflowers going. Now, we haven't talked a lot about our native grasses yet, and a lot of that is because we don't see them as often in a lot of our sites. With coastal California, definitely has a lot higher um, remnant populations of native perennial grasses, but they're super, super important in resilience of these systems as well. They also can handle disturbances really well. It's a different type of thing. So, right, it's not the seed bank, but they often can resprout and they can respond very quickly after disturbance. So this is after that Mendocino fire. This was in August. It was literally 2 weeks after the fire. It hadn't rained in months. And somehow those perennial grasses were resprouting, right? I don't even know where they were getting the water from, but phenomenal ability to resprout. This graph here is a graph looking at the percent cover of the native perennial grasses, which is in blue, versus our annual grass weeds, which are in red, and how they change year to year. And essentially, this is a lot of this is related to precipitation. That when we got drought, and especially multi-year drought, sure, the population and the cover of both the natives and exotics decreased, but you can see those native perennial grasses kept a baseline of cover and didn't dip as much as the annual grasses did. What you can also see is when we got rain after the drought, those perennial grasses bounded back very, very quickly versus those annual grasses and here they never actually fully recovered. They definitely did a couple of years later, but had to slowly rebuild their seed bank to get full cover. Another nice benefit of the native grasses, I've mentioned that we've had different waves of exotic grasses, and we're at the point where managing things like soft chest or wild oats, we're like, well, they've been here 300 years. It'd be nice to get rid of them, but we can all agree that some of the newer invasive species, like yellow star thistle and goat grass and Medusa head, are ones that are really undesirable for many, many reasons, and that we should, still be trying to control. And this is actually looking at percent cover of these late season noxious newer invaders. So yellow star thistle, goat grass, and Medusa head. And it's looking at the cover of them when they were grown with the wild oats and the non-native bromes. And so that's in green. And you can see it's just a little roller coaster. And wet years, those late season noxious weeds did great, and dry years they crashed, and they just kind of do a little roller coaster. With the natives, this is when we planted the natives in. So when the first year our native grasses were there, not surprisingly, right, these noxious weeds just were everywhere. But as those native perennial grasses were establishing, we saw steady decrease of those noxious weeds. And then, right, even post-drought, when they were doing great in the annual system, we're able to keep the noxious weeds under 15% cover, which is a really great success story in terms of restoration. And a lot of this is when we look at, this is just a cartoon of when these different species are active. So these late season noxious weeds, right, really don't get active until pretty late in the season after the bromes and the wild oats have already senesced for the season. But our perennial grasses can be there, right, and provide direct competition and push those out. There's another really important aspect in terms of resilience in these perennial grasses, and that's that they build up soil carbon. In a dry system, I cannot emphasize enough how critical carbon in the soil is. It keeps the soil a little bit fluffy, so it lets water infiltrate when we do have a big rain, and then it holds it like a sponge. So rather than that water just percolating through the soil and then getting out into the rivers, it actually can hang out in that soil so that plants are able to use it. We have a series of restoration projects that we've done where we've been looking over time to what extent planting native grasses is helping different ecosystem services. And so this is an example in Hopland Research Extension Center, again, where we had native grasses growing for 10 years. And after 10 years, we excavated the areas that they were growing. And this graph here is looking at as we go deeper in the soil, so from the surface down to 70 centimeters. and looking at how well that soil can hold water. And you can see that, right, at especially some of our deeper levels, the annual exotic grass dominated areas had pretty poor water holding capacity versus areas that were purely natives, but also a mix of natives and exotics had much, much higher water holding capacity. And this is really important because even when we only had 15 to 20% cover of perennial grasses and the rest were, the non-native oats and bromes, we still managed to see this very marked increase in water holding capacity. So essentially what this is the deeper roots of the native perennials built up more deep carbon, which allowed that sponge action to happen, right? Allowed that water holding capacity to happen. What we were seeing is, especially during drought times, is that those annual grasses normally don't root that deeply, but when the natives had built that deeper soil carbon that had the water, they actually increased their roots down there. So that further increased deep soil water holding capacity and carbon. And that when annuals were able to do that, like when they were when they were in the presence of natives and had that deep soil carbon, they were able to stay longer, 2 weeks longer into the dry season, increase their seed production by 50%. And yes, that's not great because they're exotics, but in a very drought prone system, that's actually an amazing ability to be able to keep cover and keep something being produced for the following year. And a lot of ranchers that I've talked to over the years have been kind of skeptical about putting native grasses into their systems because the cows don't like them that much. They seem to be kind of a pain, but right, this idea that we don't need very much and you can actually have much more resilience, right, even of your main forage annual grasses has been something that's getting some folks to consider putting those in. We've also seen in those series of plots that had burning and grazing, when we looked at root biomass, right, at how much root growth there was, we did see that grazing, so again, in gray compared to the ungrazed in black, we had much more root biomass in our grazed plots. And so we are currently working on the samples to see, does that mean more carbon? Does that mean more water holding capacity? I don't know, but we are actively, I'm actually leaving tomorrow morning for Hopland and spending 10 days there, setting up a new experiment where we're looking, are there ways that we can graze that not only can enhance, right, forbs, but also can enhance root production and then maybe, right, soil carbon. So just to give a sum up, we have a lot of challenges in the system, but if we think about the basic building blocks that keep the system going despite lots of different disturbances, we have incredible potential to be able to manage for that. So, right, promoting diversity. So we want lots of species, we want lots of genotypes, we want lots of different grassland types. And so this is why all of the work that you're all doing that got mentioned right before the webinar started, it's really important because, right, all of these diverse systems we have really help build our insurance policy for change. Our wildflowers, right, our forbs, super important. And it seems that we need to be promoting disturbance to be able to make sure that we've got them sitting in the seed bank ready for the next disturbance. Our native perennial grasses, right, are also really critical and promoting carbon, promoting noxious weed invasion. It is sometimes tricky to get them going. And we've been doing some work now to see if, hey, we've got these massive wildfire fires going on. If we use those as an opportunity as a blank slate and not having a lot of competition from the invasives, can we get natives successfully established? And I don't have an answer for you yet. Some places maybe, some places not. But again, we're working on that. And then finally, right, thinking about soil carbon, especially deeper soil carbon, and making sure that we're using that as a way to promote water storage in our system can be really critical. Definitely our native perennial grasses are doing that through our deep roots. We also see that our native legumes can do it. There's just a way that they decompose that actually helps build carbon that we see buildup of carbon under legumes like lupin and some of our clovers in a lot shorter time period than it typically takes to build soil carbon. And then again, work that I'm doing is looking to see, can we graze to enhance soil carbon? And then of course, there's a lot of phenomenal work happening by Marin Carbon Project and other folks on, are there carbon additions we can put into our grasslands that are going to enhance their resilience? So yeah, we have a lot of changes and we have a lot of challenges, right, in these systems, but we also have a lot of really important tools. And I just want to stress here that we need to be thinking pretty broadly about some of the ways that we are addressing this, because I am a big fan, right? My career is let's plant native species in, let's figure out how to do it successfully. Let's look at the benefits they give us. It is really important, but we have to be thinking, right, broader scale beyond that, because some of the level of changes we're happening are outside of the evolutionary potential, right? Outside of the long-term history of what some of these species are seeing. One thing, Stuart Weiss, who probably a lot of you have heard, talk, because I think he's in the realm of where your, chapter has been a champion for decades of fighting nitrogen deposition. It is very much like one of the easiest ways that we can preserve diversity, and particularly preserve the species that are going to be most drought adapted, which is really, really critical. And like climate change, that's happening at a global scale. Nitrogen deposition is a very regional scale thing, and we can do local, we can do statewide programs that can, counteract that. So that's really important. We also need to be thinking very much about water allocations, right? I've been mostly talking about grasslands, but I do a lot of work in riparian areas, as well. And right, drawing down of the groundwater is devastating a lot of these core ecosystems that are really critical for the resilience of California. And I think it's really important for us also to, I'm not saying do it, I'm going to be in a controversial way, but the way that we have just the level of new conditions that we see in these systems is of concern, and we can't just rely on old practices. So we need to at least start dabbling in potential for doing things in a different way. So we want to be thinking again about, can we get compost and biochar in? We need to be thinking about the potential for moving species and genotypes around. I completely understand there is some Frankenstein aspect of it that's very uncomfortable and that is problematic. And I'm not saying that we should definitely do it, but we need to start seriously considering it and not being resistant, because we do wind up having a lot of potential for losing some of these core genotypes and losing some species if we're not helping match to climate changes. And then finally, one of the easiest things we can do is we need to be actively managing our grasslands. It is not build a nice preserve and walk away from it. They need disturbance. They need to have some prescribed burning. They need to have some level of grazing. It may be they just need one or another and some type of disturbance, or again, mowing if you can't do those, and we're looking into that. But it's really important for us not to just think they're going to be able to maintain themselves. We need to be playing a more active role in maintaining them, given the active role humanity has in really changing their baseline conditions. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for presenting. That was wonderful.
Yeah, that was definitely inspiring to see some of the studies, especially, were super helpful. Even though we're that's sort of like in a different ecosystem than what we typically work here, but we all love that area anyway, so it's good to see what's going on there. And yeah, there's quite a few questions, actually. As you can imagine, people's imagination and curiosity is really picked on this. Would you like for us to share the questions to you, or would you want to just read them? Or how would you like to?
I'm fine however it goes. I'm seeing some in chat and there's some in Q&A. So I'm maybe I'll just bounce between one and another. And then if while I'm doing that, if you're seeing ones that are high, I don't have time to kind of screen and then go back. So if you screen and say you can interrupt me at any point and just tell me, oh, here's one that we really want you to, to talk about. But I see, right, Noreen, question about urban grasslands. Yeah, so controlled burns in at least small scale urban grasslands are hard. There's actually been a lot in urban parks. There's been a lot now more work on small scale burns because they are sort of a very efficient way. And I think all the recent wildfires have made people realize like, oh, if you're going to do this in a controlled small way, there's actually more potential for that than there had been 10 years ago. But in urban grasslands, a lot of folks are doing mowing. They're bringing in sort of sheep or goats for short amounts of time to take down, fuel load. But what that also does then is open grasses up. And so that like takes down the grasses and opens up things for the wildflower. So that is really great. Now I'm just going to go to the Q&A and I'm just going to ping pong until somebody, but so there's a great question from Susan about what plants were here before the invasive grasses came along. It is a fabulous question. We don't really know. we know there are lots of native species, right, that are herbaceous species. We don't know who was most prevalent. We don't know if the ones we have now were the ones who were dominant or if they're just the weird quirky ones that somehow hung on, right? So we don't have a good sense of that. To the extent that we actually don't even know to what extent these systems may have been grass dominated or wildflower dominated, right? So, or flip-flopped. So we have some areas that we feel pretty confident. So like coastal areas with lots of year-round, at least fog drip and things like that. When people look in the soil for essentially like little fossilized silica that was in, plants, they can see, yes, there were definitely a bunch of native grasses in here, but we don't entirely know who was here before.
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, that's a question we keep returning to, because people speculate a lot on what it was like. Yeah.
So there's a great, very hard question about what form soil carbon takes in perennial grasses. This is a really good question, and this is like actually at the forefront of soil carbon, stable soil carbon research is like what makes that happen. So I'm going to tell you sort of the best understanding at the moment, but that's still very much up for debate. And when I teach this every year, I have to look through the literature and be like, okay, what's changed this year? Because it is very much shifting. So the carbon we looked at was like what actually got incorporated into the soil and is hanging around somewhat long term, like we're talking like hundreds to thousands of years, right, in the soil. So it's not necessarily current bacteria, right, or microbes. That said, one of the key theories about how we build up more soil carbon is that the more microbial activity is, the more sort of microbial skeletons that kind of get added to the soil, that is a big part of long-term soil carbon. That's one of the theories out there. So certainly the ability to enhance the microbial community is likely a good building block to long-term carbon, but next year, I might say what we think about that is completely different. Yeah, so somebody else has a really good question about, did we differentiate between native forbs and non-native forbs in our data? We did. I just didn't, those graphs got really complicated. We did see enhancement of both native and non-native, right? So we saw a bunch of erodium or fillery. We saw, but we did see a tremendous diversity of wildflowers, native flowers in response to the fires, and again, grazing before fires. And so, right, a lot of our native tarweeds, a lot of our native lotus species, we did have lots of different, like I'd say most of the diversity of who came up after disturbances in terms of wildflowers was native. The cover was kind of part, I'm not going to say half and half, but like, right, there was a good chunk that was native and a good chunk that was non-native in terms of the wildflowers. Yeah, and so really good question about, and do these non-native annual forbs like erodium and non-native clovers compete with native forbs? Really, really good question. I don't know the answer to that. And that part of why we don't know the answer to that, some of us have been trying to look at it. The problem is, like, when we plant, typically we would look at that in a competition study, but when we plant wildflowers, they don't all decide to come up, right? So like we intend to look at it and then they just don't cooperate. So I don't I don't unfortunately have the data for that. Okay. Yeah, so ooh, this is a really good question about a grassland restoration, where one of the hardest things is trying to understand when they're all little seedlings, right? Who the native versus the annual non-native grass seedlings are, so that, right, you could actually recognize them and like get things weeded out. Oh my gosh. I wish. Right. Really, 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 really difficult. I mean, even I've been studying these for decades, and when they're that little, some of them are very like, right, I think like goat grass is a really nice obvious one that I'm like, yes, that's goat grass, I can go pluck that. But you know, a lot of these are, yes, if you look carefully and squint and look in a hand lens, then you can definitely positively identify, but that's not a way you can actually do weed control. So that is a really good question. I know there are a lot of folks, so a lot of the practitioners involved in California Native Grassland Association have been playing with like very low dose herbicides and some organic herbicides to see, can they kind of preferentially get some of the native grasses. And so folks are working on that, but I don't think there's a very, grasses before they flower are hard to identify no matter what. So I think that would be tough. Okay, in terms of controversy, why is the UC still supporting cattle production in California? That's a good question. And I think what's really, there's a lot of nuance to this, right? So I would say, like, in a lot of my grassland sites that didn't have any grazing or burning for like 50 years, I'm like, oh my God, get the cows on, get something on, right? So I think the controversy with the issue with grazing is not grazing is not grazing, right? It's where you graze, it's when you graze, it's who you graze, it's, you know, how many you graze, how often you graze. And there's a recipe in there where grazing can be devastating, and there's a recipe in there where not grazing at all can be devastating, right? And so I don't think there's any, what, like University of California has, like, even just my department, we have we're 70 faculty, have extremely different opinions on the different things, right? So I wouldn't say there's one stance. I'd say whatever stance you have, there's going to be somebody at UC who has that same right stance, and that is part of the research, is figuring out how to do some of these. Certainly in terms of when we're thinking about grassland conservation, most of our grasslands in California are privately owned, right, in our ranching. And when the ranches go under, they become ranchettes that don't get managed, and that actually lose a lot of our diversity, lose a lot of ecosystem services. So there are a lot of ranchers who are very good conservation partners. There are other examples where, right, that is not the case, but I think there's not a sort of one size fits all answer in terms of grazing. So somebody's asking if I've looked at mowing as a disturbance regime. Yes, I am working with a bunch of managers who are doing mowing, because certainly, at least here in the Central Valley, mowing's a really nice, easy thing to do, because we don't have steep hills and things like that. So mowing is very, it's a kind of with everything else, like when you do it, right, matters a lot. And so we've had mowing experiments that have really promoted diversity. We've had other mowing experiments that have become like a complete monoculture of goat grass and a complete nightmare in terms of diversity. So some of the challenge is figuring out who's lurking in the wings at our given site and what that effect, right, might be. And so I think with a lot of these, if you yourself are kind of experimenting with certain lands, maybe some small scale trials to see who might be lurking that you didn't realize was going to be a problem might be a good thing to do before sort of implementing, long range mowing, but definitely mowing in terms of promoting wildflowers is one of the good tools we have at our disposal. Yes, question about invasive French broom contributing nitrogen to the soil. I believe that is true, right? A lot of there are nitrogen fixing plants that do contribute nitrogen to the soil, and French broom would be a good candidate to that. I don't know how much they're contributing compared to, say, nitrogen deposition, but I know it's definitely something of concern. How do we fight nitrogen deposition? That's a really good question. There are some pretty, I'm not going to say that, like, there's some costs, right, and some investment, but they're pretty straightforward in terms of there's already been in some of the factories, like in the Midwest, like some certain scrubbers that go on emissions and stuff that really decrease nitrogen deposition. Same thing like is possible in terms of cars. A lot of nitrogen deposition is also coming from sort of over fertilization in agriculture, right? And so there are a lot of both regulation, but also sort of working collaboratively with the nitrogen pollution sources, whether they're companies, right, or agriculture, to be able to decrease the amount that's getting into the atmosphere, right, and minimizing that. And I'd say there's a lot of, compared to climate change, right, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit and a lot more pretty straightforward technical fixes that we can do, with nitrogen deposition. And it's something that when I do talk to state agencies or the state legislature, I'm like, it's awesome that we're thinking about groundwater storage. It's awesome we're thinking about climate change mitigation, but we've got to be thinking about, right, this one as well. Yeah, so the question about publications and websites for nitrogen deposition, I'll can I send you all some and then you can send them out to the chapter? Okay,
Oh, yes. Please.
perfect. Yeah, and nitrogen deposition 100% is like, I'd say where it first got really well documented in terms of its devastating effects on wildflowers was by Stu Weiss in the South Bay, right? So it is very much a very key Bay Area issue. Yeah, and very good question about the wildfire was in July and the prescribed fire was in June, and could that have shifted the annual grasses, in Forbes? It's a good question. I don't know, right? The other thing is the reason why prescribed fires happened was because they were particularly sort of Nazi invaded places by goat grass. So they may have also already been areas where there were fewer wildflowers because, right, and that was why they were getting targeted. So I don't, there's a lot of interest, and I know there's a lot of active work right now on at least like for controlled burns where we have control over the timing of like how the timing might influence that, but I won't pretend to speculate on Hopland. Like I'm guessing some of our difference between prescribed fire and wildfire was because we did prescribe burns on the worst spots, right, in terms of invasion. And that was so I don't, yeah, I don't know. Yes, and like, so question, comment that goats can be destructive. Any kind of grazer can be destructive if they're not managed properly, 100%, right? So and that how do we manage properly is very much sort of at the forefront of the conservation, grazing world. But I would also say that all of that, like thatch buildup, all of that, is bad in terms of diversity for our systems. It's bad in terms of production. It's also bad in terms of fire load. So we do need to be very careful how we do it, but I think we don't want to blanket say, because there's some examples where it's been done poorly, that we don't want to do it at all, because there are a number of, because I think when we don't do it, when we don't do any, thatch management at all, we also have problems. Yes, and then somebody else mentions, we do have records from when the Europeans first came to California and described what they saw. We don't necessarily know what the species were. And then also, there's a lot of really neat social science on historical records where right there, so there people will point to like John Muir's, going up to Yosemite through the Central Valley and just like waxing poetically about the amazing, wildflowers, and that, is completely stunning. And so 100%, that's what he saw. Was that a super bloom year? Was that every year? We don't, right? Those are the things we don't know. So a lot of those sort of observations, we don't have a good enough calibration of if the comments that folks were, making on that were, again, right, a super bloom, which one of us would be waxing poetic about that, or if like every year was a super, bloom. We don't have good sense of that. So I think I'm through the questions that I'm seeing.
Yes, man, that was a lot of good questions too. And thank you for answering them. One thought I had, if you wouldn't mind, I was thinking, well, first we should be bringing elk and wolves back to San Francisco, because elks, they were excellent at grazing and grazed the scrub down to grasses. And then we, of course, need the wolves to chase them around. But the idea about bringing plants from other parts north is one that we most of us struggle with.
Yes.
For one thing, of course, our situation is a little more exotic than many, because we have so little of our genetic diversity left. We're like clinging to what is still here. We estimate of the 32% of vegetated land that remains, less than 5% of that is predominantly native. So we have more introduced plants than we have remaining natives, and we've lost 30% of our native plants. So anytime somebody says, oh, bring some plants from down south, it's like, no. We know almost anything will grow here. So but one thing I was thinking back on, Dr. David Ackerley at UC Berkeley. You may know him, and he presented climate change, sort of about climate change, and basically what they were seeing. He was describing the velocity of change as the Sierra was moving from a conifer and basically they're seeing oak woodland creep into formerly conifer habitat because of the drier, hotter conditions. And well, I'm wondering if you is there enough native grasslands to even be able to do a study like that, or is it just kind of too late for that?
I think it's a good question. I think it's hard because there's a lot of fragmentation in grasslands, right? And it's I think it's hard to see things move the same way. So
Right.
there have been some neat studies looking at sort of leading edge of certain, grassland species. But I'd say, right, in California, a lot of our grassland species, not all, but a lot of our grassland species are pretty similar, right? Coast to inland and right, south to north. And so like, right, really good example, like purple needle grass, right? There are genotypes on the coast, right, that ecologically are very different than the genotypes in the Central Valley, and right, same in terms of Northern versus Southern California.
Right.
And like, we are just at the point where methodologically we can actually track those genotypes, because we sure as heck can't tell it visually.
Right.
So I think some of the more relevant questions for, right, that issue, we have not historically been able to track very well. And so but folks are doing that now. And there is a lot of concern. So we know, let's say if we move it genotype, like on the one hand, sure, if it's going to do better under, drought and heat conditions, and we don't currently have that in Northern California, but it's purple needle grass from Southern California. We're a little less concerned about a whole new species, right? But well, and I'd say, right, first the and, then the but, right? And the issue with some of the sort of gradual movement is what we're seeing with a lot of climate change is what's most disruptive is not sort of the trajectory of change, it's the extreme events that happen, right? And so it's that multi-year drought, we had a few years, back, and like that those sort of those big events are a lot bigger impact for the long term than the general trajectory. And those are the things we're worried about in terms of like, can the system maintain cover and maintain species, and then like recover after those extreme events compared to just the trajectory. And so that's a key concern on the pro side of why we might say, move a Southern California genotype here. The negative is we do know that the evolution isn't just to local climate, right? There's also like evolution of neighbors and, neighboring species that I'm used to seeing you. And so we've evolved a certain way to coexist a little bit better. And then if you sort of mix those together, then you're getting sort of this very weird disruptive, community that like has not evolved together. We also know that there are a lot of really important local adapted traits. So, extreme examples are some of the serpentine areas and vernal, pools that can be very, very ecologically different, even at a very small scale. And if we move other genotypes in, we can actually disrupt that like local evolution to the very weird, soil conditions. And so there's a lot of concern where if we don't do anything, then stuff collapses. If we do move stuff, then we create this Frankenstein monster that could also cause collapse, right? And so there's a lot of really amazing work that's happening, right now of folks who are really trying to understand, are there certain kinds of species, are there certain kinds of adaptations, are there certain kinds of habitats where this is a safer bet? And are there other ones where there's more likely to be some big disruption? And so we don't know, but the one thing we do know is that unfortunately, in a number of situations now in the conservation world, we are getting to the point where like not acting might be as risky as acting, right? And then acting and in a way that we're hoping is helpful, but might have unintentional consequences. And so and this is why, like, when I ended, I'm like, I'm not saying this is what we do, but I'm saying we need to just start being open to playing with tools that we might not have been comfortable with in the past. And not saying we should be doing them yet, but we need to start playing sort of small scale and start thinking about them.
Right. And of course, the devil's advocate is, well, humans haven't really done that well by nature
Oh,
so
gosh,
far.
no.
So do we trust? Anyway, we'll see. But no, I do trust the science. So I really appreciate you sharing the science you've been working on with us. It's super helpful for us to hear this and consider.
Well, thank you all for spending your Thursday, and for one of you, your birthday. And thanks for all the really stimulating questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, we had a great time. Thanks again.
Here, thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
everybody.
See you next month, we hope. Thanks, Val.
Thank you.
Thank you.